New home office chair with dynamic variable lumbar support and 10 ergonomic adjustments. Donating to Gladstone Research Institute to fight COVID-19 at xchair.com.
This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Mike Collins. A crippling pandemic, soaring unemployment, urgent calls to address decades of systemic racism, demands to reform the police, evaporating tax revenues with those from a Republican convention leaving Charlotte in the dust, and a deadly year for violent crime. You know, in any normal year, those would be consequential issues for public officials to deal with. But this year, they've all hit at the same time, and we're only halfway through the year. And to top it off, those aren't the only challenges city leaders are dealing with. So we wanted to pick the brains of several of those leaders to get their thoughts on where we are, where we're going, and how we get there in the face of the worst year in memory. I think that's safe to say. Dimple Ajmera is a Democrat and an at-large member of Charlotte City Council. She joins us. Good morning. Welcome.
Good morning, Mike.
Tariq Bakari is a Republican representing District 6, and he joins us from his den of technology. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike.
Democrat Larkin Eggleston represents District 1 on City Council. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
And Ed Riggs is a Republican representing District 7. Ed, thank you for being here too.
Good to be here. Good morning.
Good morning. So, Dimple, let me begin with you because you're the at-large member here on council. It's as though Charlotte and the entire nation have been hit all at once with a tsunami, and no city council, no elected body could deal with most of these things or solve most of these things separately, but they all have offshoots that impact, I guess, some things that you do have control over that you can address. The problem, I would think, is how you prioritize, where you start, and how you budget for all this. How did council, or has council, prioritized where to start, and how did you do that?
Well, 2020 has been the worst time in the recent history, but we have an opportunity to change the trajectory of our city, especially for our young people. We have been able to work through our task force and through our committees to talk about affordable housing, economic development, transportation, and public safety. With this pandemic, council has been working almost every week, meetings with our small business task force, airport task force, and housing task force to address the issues that's been come at forefront with this pandemic.
And we were experiencing, I think, a wonderful economic expansion prior to the COVID-19 outbreak in Charlotte and in many parts of the country, but certainly here. And I know that has ended. It was probably a big shock to the system for many, many people. Does it help in any way that everybody in the country is going through this, not just us?
Certainly that it is that everyone is going through that phase. However,
let me get an answer from Ed Riggs because that was directed at Ed. I'm sorry.
I wasn't sure either, Mike. I don't know that it helps in any way. The misery is widespread. I guess it loves company. The big question really is how we navigate forward and out of this again, and what kind of recovery we can look forward to. I think if you look at the stock market, there seems to be an expectation that we're going to have a pretty rapid rebound as soon as the opportunity presents itself. I'm afraid that there are structural problems like the federal debt and other issues that'll take some time to resolve. So I think we're going to be in this for a while.
You're in business, Tariq. I mean, do you think it will be easier for Charlotte to recover because we were such a hot spot, a bright spot in the nation's economic engine, so to speak? Will the same forces that drove us to that position prior to the pandemic put us back in that place when it's over?
I think we definitely have a leg up. There's no doubt about that, especially given the work that we've done in this community over the last decade to diversify more into the technology, fintech type realms, which are more nimble for environments like this. However, I think that it's not going to be a single kind of answer or statement, blanket statement across the board for all of Charlotte. I think some things are just not going to recover. There are going to, we have over 10,000 small businesses. That's businesses with 25 or less employees just in the city limits of Charlotte. And it's estimated that, over 20% of those may shut their doors down during this quarantine period and never come back. I'm very worried for Uptown. And the basis of Uptown and the small businesses that exist there and the hospitality workers that exist there, they base a lot of their need on, the workers in the large banks and the large institutions that come to work every day, and they're just not there. So we saw Queen City Q close up and close its doors for good. It was waiting on the RNC as maybe a last ditch resort for something that saved their business. So I think we're well positioned comparatively to anyone else in the United States for recovery, but it's not going to be across the board for everyone.
How would you compare, Larkin, what we're going through right now and what your constituents are going through right now to what they went through during the Great Recession?
I don't know that I can compare those things apples to apples, because obviously none of us during that recession were in the positions that we're in now. So I think that as an elected official, you have a different viewpoint that's more front row to seeing the pain of some of the businesses that Tarek just mentioned, the pain that people across the country are feeling. I think to your question about, is it better that it's going on in the entire country? Obviously, we don't want more people to be struggling, but I do think that it's created an additional sense of urgency with our federal government that there has to be relief efforts. I hope that we continue to see those coming from Washington and to some degree coming from Raleigh for our state, because people all across the state, all across the country are hurting. I don't know how you compare it to 2010, but I do think that layering on a pandemic onto the economic hardships that we're facing does make this an unprecedented time.
Ed.
I just wanted to say these are fundamentally different recessions. That one was caused by the collapse of the financial sector. This one has been caused by the shutdown of the economy. And we're in uncharted waters here. It's hard to make that comparison or to draw any conclusions from the earlier recession.
Okay, Tarek, go ahead.
I would just add, having lived through that time in the banking system here, I think there is a fundamental difference, like Ed said, between the two. In 07 and 08, it was the engine of the car, the banking system, that stalled out, and the underlying economy the fuel was relatively unscathed. It's the exact opposite now. The engine, aside from maybe some technical abilities in their digital capabilities, the banking system is running fine. The car has stalled because of the fuel, which in my opinion in the economy are the workers, the hospitality workers, all of those things, and the small businesses. And jumpstarting that is really unprecedented.
So let's talk about that, because Tarek, you and Dimple are both on the Small Business COVID-19 Recovery Task Force. How badly are businesses hurting, and in what sectors are we seeing the worst amount of suffering? Dimple.
So we have seen hospitality industry have been hit the hardest, hotels, restaurants, and we have seen a lot of businesses that are owned by minorities and women that have had struggled with access to capital. Where some of the businesses have not been able to get PPP loans or Golden Leaf resources. And we have seen some disproportionate outcome when it comes to access to capital. So we have studied that in our Small Business Task Force. With our Access to Capital program, we are trying to help those businesses who have been left out of federal and state resources by providing grants and access to capital for our micro and small businesses. And so far we have, council has approved $50 million, $30 million in survive phase and $20 million in thrive phase, which will give some of the small businesses a fighting chance that they truly deserve.
We're going to talk about, as we go through the program, some of the things that the City Council is making available. But one thing I have not seen, Tarek, is tax relief for particularly for small businesses. You can give them money, and not everybody seems to be able to get the money that's being offered by the federal government or the state government or local governments. That people get left in the cracks, but everybody pays taxes. Has there been any discussion about that?
Surprisingly, Mike, there hasn't been much discussion about that. But I would say that we've spent a lot of time and effort on the other side of that coin, which is using I think we have a roughly $154 million of federal CARES Act dollars. I think your point is really interesting that we probably should be spending a little more time on that. But in lieu of that, we've really recognized the fact that this, although it's a large sum of money, is like throwing a couple pebbles in the ocean when you think of the challenge that's there. I mean, just the $30 million grant program that the city's rolled out for small business, while they desperately need it, if you're under five employees or less, you can get up to $10,000, and up to 25 employees, up to $25,000. Relatively small amount of money, but even for a business, but even so, only about fully subscribed 1,000 businesses can get that one-time money, and that money's gone. So we recognize our balance sheet in comparison to the state and federal government for relief is small, and we need to figure out ways to spend that money smarter. In teaching how to fish rather than in providing a few fish that's only going to really honestly last for a week or so.
Ed Driggs, I know you want to chime in on this.
Just 2 quick points. For one, the city itself is suffering financially, and therefore our ability to provide city resources in relief is limited. We're working mainly with federal funds, with CARES Act funds when we provide relief to our businesses. The other thing is a tax cut would probably most benefit the people that need it the least. We really only have a property tax as a tool to work with, and we would want to be sure that the incidence of any relief we provide through a tax tool was in the right place. And I don't think it would be if we did property taxes.
Dimple.
Yes, so when we look at, to Ed's point, property tax will only help the ones that are in high tax bracket, but then we also have to look at how can we get the money out instantly? Property tax is something where folks are going to have to wait. Same thing with income tax, where when we talk about access to capital now instantly, these are the programs, whether it's PPP, Golden Leaf, or even our small business access to capital program that is city-led. Those are programs that are instantly available, because right now, small business owners are trying to figure out how to pay their employees because they are not getting enough revenue coming in, restaurants, hotel owners. So a capital that we have to, or the programs we have to look at how is it going to help the business today and not tomorrow or in future.
One of the problems that a lot of businesses around the country, not just here in Charlotte, faced when the federal government started giving out this money was that they couldn't get it. They couldn't apply for it. The systems didn't work. The money never came in. Larkin, what are you hearing from businesses in your district, from constituents in your district about how this is working now? Has the process smoothed out?
It definitely seems to have smoothed out since the beginning, and obviously that those same issues applied to the folks who were trying to get unemployment. And I think the systems just weren't built expecting any sort of volume like they've had to deal with in the last couple of months. So I do think that most of the businesses I've talked to, the things that they're eligible for have kind of panned out. It doesn't mean everybody's gotten everything they've applied for, or frankly, everything they need, but I do think that the systems have caught up with the volume. But you know, when you look at what the unemployment system is used to dealing with on a weekly or monthly basis, and what it had to deal with, there was just no way it was going to be able to have that capacity. And I think the same held true for all of the loans. So many people needed so much help that it takes a while for that to process.
When we come back from the break, I want to get into some of the things the City Council is doing, including the Thrive Hiring Grant, which I think it's something new. I had not heard about it until recently. We're here with Dimple Ajmera, Larkin Eggleston, Tarek Bakari, and Ed Driggs, all members of Charlotte City Council, and we will continue in a moment. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Novant Health, providing emergency care for people experiencing stroke or heart attack because every second counts. More about the signs and symptoms of stroke and heart attack at novanthealth.org/ER. Tomorrow on this program, we're going to pick up on a topic we're going to be discussing a little bit today. That's tear gas. It's been used nationwide during demonstrations protesting police brutality. City Council here, of course, has blocked CMPD from buying additional supplies this fiscal year, although they have enough on hand. If they need to use it, they can. Some have proposed an outright ban on the use of tear gas, but police say that without it, they might have to resort to even more aggressive tactics. How a substance banned for use in warfare became a tool for law enforcement on American streets. A little history lesson tomorrow at 9.
Who is George Soros? Ostracized by his own country, this Hungarian-American billionaire is a divisive figure in global politics. And for decades, he's been at the center of endless fake stories and conspiracy theories. I'm Jen White. What influence does he have? And why are so many fixated on George Soros? Next time on 1A.
This morning from 10 to noon, right after Charlotte Talks with Mike Collins on 90.7 WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source.
It's Charlotte Talks on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're here with 4 members of Charlotte City Council, at-large member Dimple Ajmera and District 1 Representative Larkin Eggleston, both Democrats, and 2 Republicans, District 6 Tariq Bakari and District 7's Ed Driggs. We're talking about the myriad problems or challenges that the city is facing right now because of the tsunami of things. And today we have found a real reason to have Facebook Live transmit this program as we're doing right now, because all of the rest of us are sitting in normal areas, while Tariq Bakari is in this television studio lit with colored lights and surrounded by technology. It's something you need to see for yourself. Thank you and he has sound effects. Great. Let's talk about some of the things that the city is doing. Ed Driggs, they've laid out a plan for restarting the economy with an eye on small business, which includes access to capital for small businesses and something called a Thrive hiring grant. How will that work?
Actually, I'm not on that committee. I can tell you in general what the council is doing with I talked about the CARES Act funding that we received. And we have started just in the last week or two actually writing checks and distributing them to small businesses. The problem that you referred to before about the federal government being slow or these programs being slow to access is they had to be administered in such a way as to avoid waste. And so we've now designed good programs. We've taken applications in, and the city is in the process of actually distributing those funds. But I think somebody on economic development may know more about how the Thrive program works.
Who would like to take a shot? Dimple, go ahead.
Yes, so we have streamlined our process when it comes to access to capital, Mike. We have very easy application, and it's only 8 documents where applicants can choose what 3 documents that they would like to submit. And we have seen some great results and diversity in our distribution in our phase 1. Also, when it comes to hiring grant, that really helps us tackle upward mobility, where it creates a workforce development program and helps folks get jobs right here, where really the focus is hire local talent that provides people workforce development opportunities.
The Business Journal reported last week that a federally funded city government program for small businesses awarded its first round of grants. I think it was last Tuesday, $880,000 to 79 Charlotte companies. Is this separate from what the city itself is doing, or is this how these plans that the city has developed were intended to be funded? I'm not sure which one of you to ask that question. Go ahead.
So I can answer that, Mike. So city has 2 phases, first being the survive phase and the second being the thrive phase. Access to capital program is part of the phase 1, which is the $30 million, and folks can apply for that program where small businesses could get up to $25,000 in access to capital.
Ed.
I just wanted to comment, the city put up $1 million up front from resources of our own. We then, early on, we also identified certain federal funding that was available to us that we could deploy for relief. But since then, we've been relying mainly on these federal funds. We received a total of $70 million that we're able to invest in housing and in small businesses. I told you before, we have to look after our own finances and make sure that we can continue to deliver the vital services. So we haven't had the capacity as a local government to invest a lot in these relief efforts.
So, Edric, you and Larkin Eggleston are both members of the Airport COVID-19 Recovery Task Force, and we know that airlines have been severely impacted by this virus, and travel has declined precipitously during the quarantine period. Early in this crisis, the airport reported traffic at 5%. 5% of its normal volume. That is catastrophic, it would seem to me. So what has this meant to the airport, not the airlines, to the airport and therefore to the city of Charlotte? Which one would you go ahead, Ed?
Hey, Larkin, why don't you start with that one?
Okay.
Yeah, Ed led that task force, so I'll let him take a lot of that. But obviously, when you don't have the passenger traffic, it not only impacts the airlines who are not getting the revenue from having them on the planes, it impacts the airport because we're not getting the revenue from people going through our airport or either starting or ending their trip there or using it as a pass-through as part of their trip. They're not spending money in all of those different retail outlets, food and beverage outlets. We're not getting the passenger fees that we would normally get as an airport that's seeing that traffic. So all of the things that we would normally use as streams of revenue, they dry up too. And so thankfully, airport traffic has started to rebound. Still not nearly to where it was before this, and I think it'll be a long time before it is. But a lot of our efforts there, and thankfully we did have money that was specifically earmarked for the airport, as did many airports in the country from the federal government.
When we talk about airport traffic, are we talking about people getting on an airplane from Charlotte and getting off an airplane and going into Charlotte? Are we talking about passengers that are just changing aircraft at the airport? Are we talking about landings of airplanes? Is that what we're talking about?
About 80% of the traffic, Mike, is through traffic. So
Right.
we have the tremendous advantage of being a hub, the second largest hub of the largest airline, and 80% of the traffic at Charlotte Douglas is connecting. But that still affects the businesses at the airport, and our committee was mainly focused on helping those businesses that were disadvantaged business enterprises and have contracts with the principal concessionaires at the airport. And they were very hard hit because they saw a commensurate drop in their revenue, and they don't have the same resources as airlines or the larger concessionaires. So we were able to come up with about $7 million worth of different kinds of relief, even though the federal government said that the money it had given to the airport could not be used for anything other than supporting airport operations.
The airport, I think the city considers the airport to be an economic engine. And just as American Airlines decided they would go back to full flights, Europe canceled all flights from America. And with that, a lot of direct flights from our airport to Europe were canceled. The airport, as I understand it, and we've talked about this in the past, is self-sustaining. It doesn't get money from the city of Charlotte. We don't pump money into the coffers, and nor do we take money out. So why is city council so concerned about this? Why isn't the airport just dealing with this on their own?
The airport is an enterprise fund of the city. So we have responsibility for the airport. However, according to federal laws, it is an isolated economic entity, which means it generates its own revenues and by law is required to use those revenues for the purposes of the airport. We still have a great concern about the health of the airport because of the way it impacts the health of the economy of our city and the vital role it plays in it.
Tarek, one of the things we talked a lot about on this program prior to COVID-19 was affordable housing and the things that the city was doing, and that the mayor put forth and asked the city council to support her on with regard to affordable housing. And you are, I believe, on the council's Great Neighborhoods Committee, which deals with developing the city's supply of affordable housing. How will this economic setback from COVID-19 impact those efforts?
I can only imagine. And again, I think we're still really, really focused on the immediate near term or midterm at best, which is like a quarter away from now. Thinking about the long-term implications, obviously affordable housing is going to be directly inside the scope of that. I think it's going to be bad. I mean, we were already over 20,000 unit deficit. That means if you look at the area median income, there were 20,000 more people that were below the average than there were units that they could afford, primarily rent wise. So that's only going to go up. Obviously, our commitment has been record breaking over the last 3 years and continues to be going forward on that front. But I think the bottom line is, if we're going to deal with what was already a crisis and is going to become even more so of a crisis going forward, we can't address it in a silo. We can't address it and say, all right, we're just going to throw more piles of money at affordable housing as a topic and solve it, because affordable housing is simply one of many symptoms in a broader economic disparity, upward mobility challenge. So we're going to have to get smarter rather than work harder and figure out ways to connect more horizontally all the work we do that's really been done in vertical silos, be it, transportation or affordable housing or workforce development and training. All these things are, if we don't get smarter about them, the problem's just going to get larger and larger as we spend more and more money trying to solve it.
Both Larkin and Dimple Ajmera wanted to chime in on this. Larkin, you go first.
Yeah, all those things that he just mentioned are inextricably linked. And obviously the economic development and workforce development piece of that is critical, because what we talked about a lot on the housing task force that was more COVID focused, one of the main things we've been talking about, and those meetings are still ongoing, is evictions. Obviously, evictions have been paused for some time now, which is a good thing, but that just means they're building up. And so with all the people who are out of work right now, with people whose unemployment might start to dry up in the coming month or so, there's going to be a backlog of folks who have not been able to make their rent payment or their mortgage payment or whatever. That's all going to come due at some point. Those things have not at this point been forgiven. They've just been paused. And so we've got to be prepared for the fact that while the city is continuing to be aggressive, this council put forward a $50 million affordable housing bond in 2018, and we intend to do the same again in 2020. That will put us at $100 million over 2 election cycles, when historically it had been $15 million every election cycle. So we're being very aggressive on the affordable housing front, but with all the people that are going to still be out of work and are going to be far behind on their rent payments and facing potential eviction going forward, I think the problem is only going to continue to get larger. So it's not just housing, to Tark's point, it's also jobs.
Dimple.
I'm concerned about evictions going to really affect many residents, because at the end of July, $600 that a lot of folks are getting in addition to the state unemployment checks, that's going to run out. So that's going to end. And that's where we are going to see more evictions, and we are going to see many families that are going to struggle with paying their rents or even paying their mortgages. So the program that the Housing Task Force is currently working on with the relief for our renters and for our homeowners would certainly go a long way. It will give them a fighting chance.
Let's switch gears here a little bit. Larkin Eggleston, you are the chair of the council's Safe Communities Committee, and the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis started a movement which has pushed the country toward an inflection point where ignoring systemic racism is not only unacceptable, it has become impossible. And the focus for the moment is on criminal justice, and specifically on police. Cities around the country, including ours, have promised to respond. So how would you characterize the council's stance on making sure that the city and CMPD adequately respond to citizen concerns?
Well, first, I don't think it started a movement. I think it shined light on a movement that already existed. And I think it brought a lot of new allies to the table in that movement. So certainly what happened in Minneapolis with Mr. Floyd was something that sparked a lot more outrage. It sparked a lot more involvement from people in this movement, but the movement has been there for some time now. And it dates back to all the people who have lost their lives over not only the last decade, but really over the history of this country, due in large part to systemic racism. And so I think that there are 2 tracks that the council is focused on right now. One is certainly a review of our police department policies, reimagining what we're asking the police role to be, and what we're asking them to do. Much like we've done with our teachers in this country, we have put things on police officers' plates that should have probably never been there in the first place. We're asking them to be social workers. We're asking them to deal with mental health and homelessness issues that, frankly, they're not the best people to be dealing with. They're not trained as much as we have folks in those fields that are specialists that we could send out to deal with those things. And I think that benefits the police and benefits the community if we have people who are more specialized dealing with more specialized problems. Every problem does not require a police officer to respond to it. And I think the police would agree with that. At the same time, we also have to, and the council is dedicated to, focusing on addressing in the very short term the violent crime issue that we are facing in this city. Despite the fact that we had a couple of months where folks were largely kind of cooped up in their homes, we are still on pace to see about as much violent crime this year as we did last. And that's unacceptable to all of us on council. So we are focused on addressing that now while simultaneously reviewing the policies that dictate how our police and the public interact and trying to continuously improve our department and our city as a whole.
We had that incident on 4th Street during the height of the protests in which peaceful protesters were fired on with tear gas by CMPD, and that launched a fusillade, no pun intended, of protests about the use of that. And one city council member, Braxton Winston, successfully managed to get council to say the police can no longer buy it, at least not for the rest of this fiscal year, but their stocks of tear gas are enough to sustain them if they need to use it. And last month, Ed Driggs, you said that you would need more information to determine whether officers were wrong to deploy tear gas against protesters in that incident. Did you ever receive that information?
But we did get the SBI report, which I think concluded that there were, in fact, avenues of egress from there. And I believe validated the actions. I don't think it was CMPD's intention to create the situation that we had, and I think they're thinking about that. But this was not a deliberate kettle operation, and it did not contain the crowd as totally as the early videos suggested.
Tarek, you and Ed have been staunch defenders of the police, if I'm not mistaken, during most of this. And you have said, and others have said, that taking tear gas out of the toolkit might lead to other tougher tools being used by police because that's all they'll have at their disposal. Are you on that page, Tarek?
Almost. I would just put an asterisk next to that to say doing so as a quick gut reaction to appease an angry crowd without forethought would certainly be a recipe for disaster, because that's what essentially was attempting to happen. We had closed sessions, and then we had updates from multiple parties all in that first week after all that happened. And we heard from the city manager, we heard from the police chief, and we heard from the city attorney, all separately over that week period, that said essentially the same thing to us. And this is what everyone was basing their knowledge on. I saw the same videos that went viral that you did. They were disturbing. They upset me. However, as I dug deeper and learned more and saw more, I found there is more to this story that will, I believe, once you see and see the reports, you all will understand that as well. And despite
why haven't we seen there seems to be an urgency to this here and around the country. So why haven't we seen those reports?
But we have
clear
seen
things
reports.
up.
That's the point. The whole point is everyone reported on the viral videos and said kettling, and this was the police were bad. And then the mayor and council came out of closed session and said all these things about how they've made mistakes. And this is not a proud moment. And at the end of the day, the SBI report that came out didn't get publicized the way everything else did, and it showed them they were indeed following policy.
So tear gas is a problem, but and we'll do a whole program on it tomorrow. But there's a bigger problem, and that is how police interface with citizenry, and we'll talk about that and about the reimagining of the police that the council would like to see when we come back. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Catawba Riverkeeper Foundation, presenting CLT Future 2020, a competition for high school students to tackle environmental problems in the region. Event and partner info at catawbariverkeeper.org. George Soros is a Hungarian-American billionaire and philanthropist, and until recently, he was most famous for founding Central European University in Budapest. But these days, his name and reputation carry a very different meaning. He has become the subject of many far-right conspiracies. So how did a Hungarian businessman who was relatively unknown in this country before the 2016 election come to be held responsible for so much? And why have conspiracy theories about him persisted? They'll be taking that up in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock on 1A. And we will continue our conversation with 4 members of Charlotte City Council about all the challenges they face in just 30 seconds. Stay with us.
How has your life changed since the outbreak of the coronavirus?
She was, telling me, Mom, I'm afraid I'm going to die.
WFAE wants to hear your story on the challenges you faced and what your hopes are for the future.
If there is a silver lining to any of this, it's that it was okay for us to all be with her. We didn't have other places to be.
Be a part of WFAE's social distancing series by leaving a voicemail at 704-916-9114 or go to WFAE.org for more information.
It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking with 4 members of Charlotte City Council. Dimple Ajmera, the at-large member on the panel this morning. Larkin Eggleston, Democrat from District 1. Ed Griggs, Republican, from District 7. They're all joining us from their home offices, as am I. But joining us from his bat cave is Tariq Bakari, Republican from District 6. Dimple, there is a cut and dry demand by a large contingent of people across this country, including here in Charlotte, about changing how police conduct themselves and how they interface with citizens. And so far, we've heard a lot of vague talk about how that will translate into training and behavior, but clearly change had better be coming. If it doesn't, you're going to erode trust in police here and around the country. So City Council has vowed to reimagine CMPD. That sounds vague. What does it mean?
Well, we have an ambitious 90-day plan to review our CMPD policies and practices and also look at our budget, CMPD's budget. Mike, we are at the crossroads as a nation where we have an important opportunity to address the real issues that our community faces: racism, police brutality, and the systemic changes. And the council is committed to addressing the systemic change with this 90-day ambitious plan. We also are taking a holistic approach for the first time, where violence reduction will be discussed as part of every committee: affordable housing, economic development, transportation. We are also looking at violence interrupter model, where we are working with community activists. We are working with organizations and grassroots leaders to interrupt crime and violence. So certainly, council is taking a new approach and trying to find solutions to address racism and police brutality, but to also address violence that we are seeing. There is another tool that council talked about on Monday. It's called nuisance abatement. City of Durham has certainly implemented that very successfully, where they have been able to see a change in neighborhoods and to address violent crime. And certainly now with our city attorney, Patrick Baker, we are exploring that model as well as to how we can replicate that here in our city, where we can address problem properties.
I didn't hear a lot of specifics, but we'll try to get into these, some of them in the next few minutes. But you keep saying that we have a ambitious 90-day plan. And Ed, you have said the current strategy could evolve into a recipe for disappointment. You've said we really need to think big picture, keep it simple, and do something soon. How soon?
Well, I think law enforcement tensions are a symptom of a larger disease. And I don't think we can cure the disease by pouring ice water on the fever. And we run the risk of undermining our public safety priority by attempting to do so. So my feeling is that trying to restructure the police department is going to not produce the results that people are hoping for or that are expecting by virtue of our process. We need to identify certain actions that we can take quickly in response to the immediate demands and always continue to try to improve policing and our relationship with the community, but not kid ourselves and think that there is some radically different solution out there waiting to be found.
However, Tarek, City Council also recently did approve a resolution ordering CMP to adopt these 8 rules from Campaign Zero, which is a policy initiative linked to the Black Lives Matter movement. It calls for a ban on chokeholds and strangleholds. It requires de-escalation. It requires warning and the exhaustion of all alternatives before police shoot. It mandates other officers intervene if they see something going on with other police behavior that's wrong. It bans shooting, moving vehicles, establishes a use of force continuum, and it requires all force to be reported. But a data scientist with that group, the Campaign Zero group, has accused CMPD of trying to mislead the public, saying that in many cases, CMPD policies don't conform to the standards suggested by this 8 Can't Wait initiative. So what's your response to that?
Well, first, I think it's fitting that we all answer the question before Larkin. And that's just because Larkin obviously is the chair of that committee and did the 8 Can't Wait work, but I prefer taking the credit from him. So I think what I'd say is the 8 Can't Wait thing, I think that was a pretty good example of something that city council should be doing, right? Where we look at it now, I think that in fairness, the cops already did most of those things, if not all of them. I think that what has to be parsed out based on that that data scientist view is how effective is there the devil that's in the details there. And I don't know how that person could possibly know that it conforms to it, because most of those policies are about tactics and they are not public information. So most of the council can't even see that stuff, because if the bad guys, whoever those may be in whatever scenario, know the exact protocols of CMPD or the Secret Service or the FBI, well, that's suddenly a very dangerous situation. So I think the bottom line with all this is, back to the broader question, is either we did a good job and made progress after 2016 as we task forced and committed this city to death for years, or we didn't, and we're about to do the same thing again now. I think there's a lot of misinformation and confusion out there as it relates to the balance between taking a scalpel and finding a couple things to make our police department better versus appeasing the crowd with a kind of a smoke and mirrors of here's what we're going to do, when in reality, it's exactly what we've already been doing, and we've just kind of branded it and packaged it differently.
So Larkin, we have this 8 Can't Wait initiative that's been put forward, and there are other things, that this 90-day plan that Dimple talked about a minute ago. I'm just curious if you can flesh it out a little bit more. What does council want to see?
So a couple things real quick. The 8 Can't Wait, I think the disconnect that you see from what the folks at Campaign Zero are saying and what the folks at CMPD are saying is CMPD is saying we have something in our policies that addresses each of these 8 things. And to a degree, that's true, including that they just added language into our policies that talks about a duty to intervene. And so no one on council has said that we're starting from scratch here, that CMPD has never made any attempts to address any of these things. But just because we have a policy that addresses these things doesn't mean we have the right policy to address these things. And so I think that we can constantly, with this and all other policies, not only with CMPD, but with all of our departments, all the work we do as a local government, we can constantly be improving. And so I think that's the goal here, is Campaign Zero isn't saying we don't do any of this. They're saying maybe there's a best practice that we are not fully in compliance with. And so that's what we're seeking to close the gap on. I do also think we're at a point in time right now where we have the perfect opportunity to review and update and improve these policies. You had our new chief, Johnny Jennings, on, I believe, last week. Mm-hmm. And he is, at least in my experience with him, and so far as our new chief, a week and change in, he seems receptive to having these conversations, to being a partner in this work. So this is not something, Dimple and I both serve on the Safe Communities Committee. None of us on that committee, and I don't think any of us on council, view this as an exercise in doing something to the police. We're working with the police and with the community to try to improve these outcomes. So the plan that Dimple was, you look like you wanted to jump in there, Mike.
That's okay. You continue.
The plan that Dimple was talking about is how we are going to, again, on parallel tracks, review not only the things that we need to do in this community to, in the very immediate future, address the violent crime issues that everybody is well aware we're facing as a city, but also to week by week go through and review a lot of the CMPD policies that have not been looked at in a long time. And to use one example, what you just talked about, how we deal with peaceful protest, how we deal with dispersal orders, and you've already seen changes be made. Not every change takes a long time to make. Some will undoubtedly, but there have already been changes made in terms of how dispersal orders are given to crowds of protesters, and that you would not deploy crowd dispersal tactics from both sides of a crowd as was done that night, regardless of the idea of whether there was a means of egress or not. So we can, even if policies weren't violated there, it doesn't mean we can't improve those policies and make sure that we have better outcomes next time.
One of the things that the city was embarking on prior to these protests was identifying areas of the city where the most crime comes from. And it's a very small geographic area. I think it's about 2 miles.
2 square miles.
Which accounts for 8, which accounts for 8
miles in total, Mike.
So, okay, yeah. Which accounts for 8% of the city's violent crime. Among those areas is Beatty's Ford Road, which is where that Juneteenth celebration erupted into gunfire for whatever reason. And you have said, Larkin, that we can't wait. There's an urgency to take action on these areas, and that had we had in place the violence interrupter program that Dimple referenced a moment ago, that perhaps that could have prevented what happened on that Juneteenth celebration. How would that have worked? How do you interrupt what sounded like, when you listen to the tape, automatic gunfire?
So Dimple mentioned 2 parts of that. There's 2 parts to the interrupter program, and Beatty's Ford corridor is one of the places that we're going to pilot that initially, as is 85 and Sugar Creek, which obviously everyone is well aware we have a lot of issues with also. So Dimple said we've got 2 pieces of this. One is a hospital piece. When people are going into any of our hospitals in the area as victims of violent crime, we have people that are coming in and trying to connect them to the services and the resources that they need. The piece that I think speaks more specifically to your question is that we've got these violence interrupter programs that are in the communities, on the streets. And it takes what this was a multi-day celebration that was going on in that area. I believe it was Friday night where the celebration started. And in the evening time, it kind of shifted from more of a celebratory and positive event into something more negative. There was some gunfire. There was not the victims that we saw of that gunfire 2 days later. When you see those sort of things start to come to sort of a rolling boil, before the pot can boil over, you send in people who can intervene. You send in people who can identify where there are problems, where there's the potential for escalation of some of this violence, and you try to intervene and steer it in a different direction. So I think had we had that program in place, you start to see the little sparks of things taking a turn for the worse on Friday. You intervene in the meantime, and hopefully Sunday doesn't turn out the way that it ultimately did.
In the few minutes that we have remaining, let's talk about something that's probably near and dear to all of your hearts, and that is the Republican National Convention. How many of you are relieved that the Republican National Convention will not be held here this year? Let's go around the table here. Larkin.
Yeah,
are you
I was just raising my hand because you asked the question. I mean, we had consistently said we were willing to host that in any event that was willing to comply with whatever safety, public health rules there were. They didn't seem to be.
Just a quick answer to all this. Are you relieved, Dimple?
Absolutely.
Tarek?
No, I am actually a big supporter of our small businesses and hospitality workers, so I'm not relieved. Sorry, Mike.
Ed? No, it's okay, Ed.
I've been involved since the start. I'm disappointed that the event that we intended can't occur. I'm quite happy that the event that can occur isn't happening here.
Wow. Okay. The New York Times recently wrote that the abrupt uprooting of the RNC from Charlotte and its move to Jacksonville has created money woes for both cities. Aside from lost revenues, is the city of Charlotte out of money that is it out money that we would not have spent had the convention never been scheduled to arrive here? And if so, do we get that money back? Is there a plan to get that money back? Who can take that?
The one thing that all of council agrees on is that we want to make sure the city is made whole in this, and that's the work that's going on right now.
Ed.
Mike, the city didn't have any financial exposure anyway. We had a $50 million grant from the federal government. The host committee raised private funds of $70 million to pay for other expenses. So we didn't have a large exposure. We've been reimbursed by the federal government grant for any outlays that we had.
Dimple.
So city has spent about $14 million so far with insurance and safety costs. which we are hoping to be reimbursed by this grant. And I have full confidence in our city attorney to protect our financial interest as well as protect us legally.
A lot of the concern over holding the convention here had to do with our image as a city and its association with Donald Trump. I'm not sure that those are valid concerns or something that should be concerned about, because we host a lot of events here that you don't have to agree with, I suppose. But in recent weeks, the president has become more and more apparently white supremacist in his comments. Do the two Republicans on this panel, Tarek and Ed Driggs, does it worry you that the standard bearer of your party appears to be sliding in the polls and taking a campaign approach that a lot of people view as divisive?
I think Trump is doing what he's always done. And like it or not, we knew that he was controversial when we first contemplated pursuing the convention. It was never meant to be a rally for him. It was meant to be an opportunity for local businesses. And I think you need to be cautious about interpreting the polls. If you consider the way the behaviors of the anchors on the night of the election against Hillary Clinton, they were all ready to celebrate, and he surprised them. So it's unfortunate because I personally find it unattractive, but I wouldn't count the guy out.
I would say that obviously I agree, you know, he is who he is, but at the same time, it seems today with the mainstream media and how they report everything and the lack of trust that exists out there with the general public, there's a lot of people, including myself, that are skeptical on some things. And in a bottom line, you have someone like Trump who shoots off tweets and is brash and rough, and that has been narrated as that's the bad guy. And then you've got, you know, career-like politicians like a Governor Cooper, who's smooth and polished, but behind the scenes navigating and doing things that literally are designed in a presidential election year to create an issue that that creates essentially what our small businesses got screwed with.
Well, guess what? You've screwed over your Democratic compatriots who want to. They don't have time to respond now because we're out of time. Dimple Ajmera, Larkin Eggleston's the two Democrats, Tarek Bakari, Ed Driggs, the two Republicans on City Council. Thank you all.
Nice move, Tarek.
Charlotte Talks with Mike Collins is a production of 90.7 WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from Mazda of South Charlotte. Wendy Herkey is the executive producer. The senior producer